Well, welcome to Let's Talk Conversations on Race, and welcome Dr. Jemar Tisby.
Thank you for having me. Conversations on race is what I love to talk about. So this is perfect.
I know we have a lot in common, including that. Yes,
Yeah.
so good. It's so good to have you. Dr. Jemar Tisby, for our viewers and listeners who might not know, is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Color of Compromise: The Truth About the Church's Complicity in Racism, How to Fight Racism, and How to Fight Racism, the Young Readers edition. Dr. Tisby is the co host of the Pass the Mic podcast. He speaks nationwide on the topics of racial justice, US history, and Christianity. Dr. Tisby earned his PhD in history, and he studies race, religion, and social movements of the 20th century. And you could follow his work through his newsletter Footnotes and also on social media at Jemar Tisby. So welcome again. So to start with, your and I have his book right here. Actually, I can see it in your background. The subtitle of this book, which we'll be talking mostly about, is "Courageous Christianity and the Journey Towards Racial Justice." And I just wanted to get us talking, start us off with, why does this journey require courage?
It's so good. So in my first book, The Color of Compromise, I talk about the failures of many Christians to confront racism, and instead they compromised with it or were complicit with it. And so I call that a complicit Christianity, right? And in contrast, we need a courageous Christianity that has the boldness to confront racism. And the reason why it takes courage is because it's costly.
Hmm.
It is
In what way?
costly to confront racism.
Mhm.
Um, it costs you socially, politically, economically, at least, right? There's certainly other ways, mentally,
Mhm.
um, physically, in the
Yeah.
toll that it takes on our bodies, right? And the violence even that can be threatened or actual. Um, I think in terms of white people, it's costly to confront racism because it could potentially cost you your community.
Mhm.
That racism operates on a social compact among white people
Mhm.
that if you support a racist status quo, you will be part of the in group that gets certain privileges and opportunities. These could be financial, job prospects, even romantic relationships, and who
Mhm.
you get to be partnered with, that kind of a thing.
Mhm.
And if you break that compact,
Mhm.
then you get excluded from the group. You
Mhm.
lose the advantages of being considered white and being in solidarity with whiteness.
Mhm.
And you also lose that sense of belonging and identity. I mean, this has ostracized people from their families. It
Mhm.
has lost folks' friends. We see this all the time in the
Mhm.
social media age, and
Yeah.
and so it's costly in that sense. Costly in a lot of other ways, but I mean, just to get to the heart of it, I think a lot of white people remain silent because they know that to speak up will put them on the outs at their church or with parents or
Mhm.
siblings or coworkers, and
Mhm.
that's costly to
Yeah.
them. For Black people and other people of color, it's costly in other ways. We get labeled as the
Mhm.
angry Black person or what have you. The person who I've get frequently accused of, everything is about race with you.
Mhm.
Well, the answer is, it's probably a lot more about race than other people think it is. Um,
Mhm.
but the idea that well, all you see is racism, so you can't be trusted or whatever.
Mhm.
And it's costly in terms of opportunities. I mean, I I think the landscape has changed a lot, but I used to get invited to places with people who had varying opinions about
Mhm.
racial justice just to
Mhm.
hear me out, right? And I was
Mhm.
glad to go, even though it was kind of a nerve-wracking experience to go
Mhm.
into what could potentially be a hostile environment. Those
Mhm.
opportunities don't come anymore.
Yeah.
And part of that is livelihood. Part of my income comes from going to places, speaking, things like that. So it's
Mhm.
costly in those ways. I think it's also costly, mentally. Like I said, it's very exhausting.
Mhm.
It's very stressful. There's gaslighting, people saying, racism is a thing of the past, that what you're saying is racist is not in fact racist, calling left, right, and up, down kind of a thing. And
Mhm.
just this sort of, they call it weathering,
Mhm.
the sort of erosion of your resilience that comes with trying to persist in justice,
Yes.
persist in doing justice, not persist
Yes.
in justice.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so yeah, it's costly in those kind of ways, and therefore it takes courage.
Yeah. I relate to so much of what you said because when you were talking about social ostracization, I think even Black people can experience that in terms of or counting the cost with friendships. Just um, my sons are in a mostly white school district and have experienced varying levels of racism. And sometimes I've wondered, when I speak up to
Mhm,
whomever, I often feel like I'm the first person to speak up. Now, I'm
mhm.
probably not the first person to speak up, but I wonder sometimes if just as Black people, we just want to keep our head down and just push through.
Yes.
Um, my husband is a Jamaican immigrant, and I know he talks about that as the immigrant experience. Just put your head down and push through.
Yeah.
Don't make waves. If it's your kids in school, you don't want anything being taken out on your kids. You know,
Mhm.
so I think it takes courage for us in that too to speak out. And
That's
then
right.
and then what you were saying about the mental fatigue, you know, I I have to take breaks from this work.
Yes. Yeah.
It's just mental breaks just to lift my brain out of this
Mhm.
lane and just put it in something else for a time, and then I'm pulled back into it. But
100%. Yes.
because it's very personal, yeah, and I have I think especially during I'm remembering during Obama's first or second run, I had people question my salvation, and yeah, and friends unfriend me, and I wasn't even that. I was gung ho, but it wasn't like every post was about Obama. It wasn't
Right,
obnoxious,
right.
I think, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh, oh,
Yeah,
you're making such great points. I mean, a lot of people are surprised when I say, like, I haven't seen, movies like 12 Years a Slave, or whatever the latest kind of treatment around racism is, because I deal with this stuff every day, all day. And if
yep,
I have time to watch something,
yeah,
it's going to be an action, or it's going to be a comedy.
yep,
And
exactly,
it's going to be something that completely takes me into a different frame of mind, that sort of lightens the mental load for a
yes,
moment, so
yeah,
that I can go back and engage in, I hope, meaningful ways in my day to day,
yeah,
with that. So there's a rhythm to fighting racism.
yeah,
There's the idea of, some form of a Sabbath, in the sense of, like, just resting from the work.
yeah,
And I really do think we submit ourselves to almost a slavery mindset, in the sense that we will wear ourselves out in the
mhm,
name of productivity and
mhm,
working. And it's another form of exploitation.
yeah,
It might even be self-exploitation. But we
yeah,
have for me, one of the recent, truths I'm trying to live into, is that part of resisting racism is resting,
yeah, right,
you
being
know,
healthy,
being healthy.
yeah,
So it's something that's really hard to do, because the problem is constant. It's ongoing. Racism never takes a break, but that
right.
doesn't mean we can't. As a matter
Right.
of fact, we should as a way
Yeah.
of resisting.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. So in your book, How to Fight Racism, you use an acronym ARC or ARC, um, awareness, relationship, and commitment. And we're going to frame most of this conversation within that arc, within the ARC. So I want to talk about the awareness first. And that's sort of talking about the very thing we've just been talking about, what we do, which is the need or the burden for people to make people aware of
Mhm.
the history of race and racism in this country and why it's still such a salient issue. I don't, probably you too, but in 2020 I had so many white friends say something like, I don't know how we got here, after Floyd
Wow.
was killed. And I'm like, I know
Yeah.
how we got here. You
Yeah.
know how we got here. But it's still like, so making people aware of how did we get here? Um, and you said that it's especially important for Christians to be aware because throughout US history and the history of colonialism worldwide, quote, people who claimed Christianity as their religion have been the progenitors and perpetuators of racism. And that's deep and troubling. And so can you talk about that, about Christians being the progenitors and perpetuators of racism?
I had a question from someone not long ago, which was, they were not religious and they weren't hostile, but they were basically saying, why should I care? Why is it important? And and
Mhm,
and what I said was, if you want a thorough understanding of race, then we have to understand how race and religion have been mutually constitutive.
mhm,
So as we record this podcast, just about a week ago, the Pope, the Roman Catholic Pope, finally um, repented on behalf of the Church for the doctrine of discovery. So
mhm,
in 1452, there was a papal bull that essentially baptized colonialism and
mm,
said, go out into these pagan lands with
mhm,
non-Christians, take the land, take the
mm,
resources, make our nation richer. And oh, by the way, you can evangelize and convert them to Christianity. That is
mhm.
your divine right.
Yep.
And do we see, you can see there, centuries in the making, how this idea of race and a racial hierarchy begins to form right alongside ideas of religion and Christianity, right? That
Mhm.
there would be this people divinely commissioned by God to go out and conquer the world in the name of God, extract
Yes.
resources, and categorize people first as pagan, and then as these ideas evolve as, you know indigenous people and black people and the other, right? So they're forming each other, right?
Mhm.
Another really powerful example that stood out to me, I talk about in The Color of Compromise, but it comes out of a personal experience I had. I was in Williamsburg, Virginia, near Point Comfort, where the 20 and odd Negroes were brought in 1619, and they have a little museum around that. And I was going around, and as a historian, I'm reading every single thing, and I'm glad I did, because there was this passage that pulled from a policy that the Virginia Assembly had enacted in 1667, which in modern terms it said baptism would not emancipate a Native American, an African, or a person of mixed race descent.
Mhm.
And to me, that policy was
Mm.
so illustrative because you have race, religion, and politics all combined. So you have
Mhm.
this political body making a policy, making it the law of the land around a religious practice of baptism
Mhm.
that was race based because it applied to Native Americans, Africans, or people of mixed race descent. And
Mhm.
so, with those three, race, religion, politics, you can distinguish them, but they're really inseparable. And
Mhm.
so that's why I talk about the idea of, Christianity being a progenitor and a perpetuator of racism. And you can go down through history, right? There are pro-slavery theologians, there are pro-segregationist pastors and Christians, people arguing from the Bible in their
Mhm.
view
Mhm.
for this racial hierarchy. And again, even in the contemporary times, we see one of the things I talk about now is white Christian nationalism, and how we
Mhm.
saw that on display on January 6th was not
Mhm.
only anti-democratic, but it's
Mhm.
also trying to reinscribe a racial hierarchy with white people at the top and the center of political and cultural life.
Yeah, right, and feeling like they're being replaced and displaced. Um, yeah, actually, I think you said in a podcast that I listened to, you have to ask yourself, what would be the harm in being replaced?
Mhm.
Would this country be less Christian, quote unquote Christian? I don't think it's a Christian nation in the first place, but yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm thinking too of when people who had a lot to lose, slavery in this country, began when their conscience began to bother them, they had to come up with a theological and scientific reason why it was okay to keep Africans enslaved. And so there were all these theological treatises being written, because if we are to call ourselves Christians, then we have to justify that we can't, as Christians, we can't enslave human beings. So we have to basically dehumanize
Mhm. Mhm.
these
Mhm.
enslaved Africans. And they had to find theological reasons for doing that.
That's right. I mean, we like to think that our actions flow from our ideas, and
Yeah.
usually it's the reverse. That we act a certain way, or that we have these certain customs and practices established, and then we find a theology to justify it.
Yeah.
So I think it's critical that as we talk about something like race-based chattel slavery and its legacies, that
Mhm.
we understand that fundamentally it was a system of economic exploitation.
Yeah.
One of the things I say in the first book, The Color of Compromise, but which drives some of the practical aspects in the second book, How to Fight Racism, is that a lot of people say that slavery was America's original sin.
Mhm.
And I think it might be more accurate to say that slavery was America's original symptom, and its
Mhm.
original sin is greed.
Yeah.
Because it was the greed that systematized and codified a practice of unfree labor that became race-based chattel slavery.
Yeah.
And it was very practical concerns around how it became attached to an idea of race. Indigenous people were hard to enslave. Uh,
Mhm.
it was they had home court advantage, so to
Mhm.
speak.
Mhm.
They knew the land way better than Europeans. They could survive and live. There were a
Mhm.
lot of colonists who would have died if not for the support of indigenous people.
Mhm.
And they also had allies because this is their home. And
Mhm.
so other people would, if someone was enslaved, they had a tribe or family or someone who could come and fight on their behalf, right? And
Right,
then
right.
it became, well, we can import these Africans.
Mhm.
They're cut off completely from their homeland. There's nobody coming to help. We can
Mhm.
control them a lot better. They don't know the land here. Um,
Mhm.
and so that was a practical concern. Why? For a bottom line motive.
Yeah.
Because I'm not an economist, but in the simplest terms, what is the goal of capitalism is to maximize profit and minimize loss.
Mhm.
And in any sort of budget, typically your biggest line item is going to go to salary, wages, and benefits. And
Yeah.
so the quickest way to cut costs and therefore increase your bottom line is to cut salary, wages, and benefits. Or what happened in slavery is you don't pay your laborers at all.
Right.
And I say all that to say it is the economic exploitative aspect of racism that people continue either to miss completely or to severely downplay.
Yes.
The measure and the degree to which the prospect of making money or losing money led to ideas around racism.
Mhm.
And to get back to your original point, theology, right?
Mhm.
So now that we found this profitable way of exploiting people, oh, you know what? That's the way God intended it.
Right,
So
you're right. It's
we
almost
have
comic. If it weren't so tragic, it'd be comic.
exactly, so then we have the curse of Ham, right? Which is really
Yeah,
curse of Canaan. It's just bad theology in general,
right.
right?
Yeah,
And then you have, ideas. Oh, there was this one pastor, G.T. Gillespie in Jackson, Mississippi, who on the heels of Brown v. Board gave an address to another group of pastors, Presbyterian ministers in Jackson, and he uses just the worst theological biblical studies reasoning you could imagine. If this was a seminary paper, he would have flunked, because he goes to like the book of Leviticus, and he looks at laws where you don't mix certain fabrics together, or
yeah.
red birds and blue birds don't fly together. Therefore,
Therefore,
black people and white people should be segregated. And it's like,
right.
what? Talk
Yeah,
about a tragedy and a comedy all
yeah,
mixed up.
yeah. I know. I remember reading that part of your book, and I was like, "What part of the Bible were these people reading?" I mean, what about the fact that Moses had a black wife, and and the book of Acts, the second chapter of Acts, and the vision that Peter got about nothing being unclean, and
Mhm, mhm.
Revelations chapter 7. I mean, like, there's just so much in scripture to suggest that, and we're going to get to this more soon, but that integration and people coming together is God's idea, and
Right,
separation is man's flaw.
right, right.
um, even just getting on Peter's case about not wanting to go to the Gentiles.
Mhm,
So, yeah. So you also noted that it was Black Christians who led the civil rights movement. They were committed Christians, and they gained their courage and strength from their faith.
mm,
And they were joined by white people who also held a disdain for racism. Um, but you said that white people, and we sort of were talking about this, still bear the most responsibility for racism because of white supremacy, or the belief that white people and their culture are inherently superior to other cultures. So, I think we all try to be, it's part of emotional intelligence or whatever, to try to be conciliatory, like, well, it's both sides, everybody has
right,
faults, sort of, there's good people on both sides,
right.
like, I think as often as possible, we try to say those kinds of things. But here you are saying, no, sure, we are all sinful. But when it comes to racism, white people bear the burden for racism in the Western world. So
Absolutely.
can you talk about that? I mean, you sort of already have, but can you say
No,
anything?
there's a lot of dynamics that go into that. So you're absolutely right. The impulse is to say, okay, we're all messed up. So I'm not pointing fingers, and I'm not saying that, I get it. I get it. We want to be nice. We want to be polite. But racism is about power,
Yeah.
and it consolidates or hoards power among a certain group of people. And we're talking about racism that's really, in my view, an expression of a bigger concept of white supremacy.
Mhm,
Or you could say white centeredness, or white normativity, or, as some have said, the narrative of racial difference. Right? It's
mhm,
it's it's a racism is an expression of a story we tell ourselves about human worth, and
mhm,
how that might differ along the color line. Right? And in that story, there is a superior group which has been
mhm,
labeled white.
mhm,
And what that superiority entitles white people to is
mhm.
more power, is
Yeah,
more privilege. So
yeah,
to say that white people bear more responsibility is to say that white people have benefited more from racism, right?
right.
Now, that is
Yes.
not to say, I think the crucial thing to mention is racism hurts everyone.
Right.
So we often think that racism is a problem that only affects Black people, but it is a problem that adversely impacts white people as well, right? So
Mhm.
that's there.
Yeah.
But in terms of sort of the social, political, economic, educational benefits of whiteness, that
Mm.
goes to people considered white. Therefore,
Mhm.
and it was a system created to give them advantages. Therefore, they bear responsibility, the most responsibility
Yeah.
for making things right. Now, in the same breath, I say the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution,
Mm.
which is to say that Black people, who I talk about, we have experienced racism up close and personal for a
Mhm.
long, long time.
Mhm.
We understand the depth and the contours of the problem better than most white people.
Mhm.
Therefore, we can offer better solutions than most people who don't understand the problem as well.
Wow.
And so there is that, and this is what I say to Black people, there's that fatigue we talked about earlier, that mental fatigue. We have to take breaks. We have
Mhm.
to take care of ourselves. No one's coming to our rescue to do it for us.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if we leave it to white people to figure out how to fight
Mhm.
racism themselves, oh, it's just gonna be a mess.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
I don't know how this got through, but the example that comes to mind, you remember, I think it was like 2017, Black Lives Matter is going, and there's this Pepsi commercial, and I think it's Kendall Jenner, and she's holding a Pepsi can, and there's this line of protesters, and then there's this line of police armed in riot gear. And Jenner breaks ranks with the line of protesters and offers one of the police
A Pepsi.
officers a Pepsi, as if that's going to bring people together. Solve the problem of anti-Black police brutality. And that ad just got trashed and
Good.
dragged, rightfully so. But
Right.
that's what we're going to end up with if
Yes.
we as
Yeah.
Black people and people of color don't at times and in certain circumspect ways say we've been close to the problem, we are close to the solution as well, so let me offer you this insight and perspective.
Yeah. And so how tragic it is when Black people aren't at the table. Whether it's
Absolutely.
Black people aren't at the table in churches, in
Yeah,
white-led churches, or
yeah,
Black people aren't at the table in politics, or Black people aren't at the table in education. Like,
yeah.
when we're not at the you could still have some really, well-meaning white people around that table who see racism and wanna do something about it, but like you said, it's not gonna be sufficient if there are also no Black people around that table.
That's right. Or at
Yeah.
least on the bookshelf or
Yeah.
in the podcast lineup. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to access our knowledge. So people
Yeah.
need to tune into your show and
Yeah.
glean some wisdom and information. So it's out there. There's really at this point in the information age and the digital age, there's zero excuse
Yeah.
for not accessing the wisdom that
Yeah.
comes from the experience of the oppressed.
Yeah.
And you can
Yeah.
apply that to any justice issue. I mean, we can still, in different ways, hear the voices of incarcerated women and men. We can
Mhm.
hear the voices of people who have an immigrant experience and what they've gone through. We can hear the voices of refugees, right? And to the extent that we want to be part of the solution, we have to hear from the people who have been close to the problem.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, so good. There was something in my mind that just left, so I'll I'll keep going. Um, this is what it was. So you were talking about the benefit of those who were considered white. And, I've heard it said, I'm sure you've heard it said so many times, people who want to sort of mitigate the effects of racism. Well, there was discrimination against the Italians and the Irish were
Mm,
indentured servants and blah, blah, blah. And, even Jews, even though they're obviously anti-Semitism is severe and terrible, but how is the Black experience? The Black experience is so different from the Italians, Jews, and Irish.
yeah.
I don't understand how anybody could equate those two. But what do you think? What do you say when people say that to you?
So I'm not a therapist, but I think psychologically, what people are trying to do is say uh, it's a defense mechanism from feeling like they're the bad one, the evil person, right?
Yeah.
For being white. And
Mhm.
they say, well, my people suffered too, as a
Mhm.
way of saying, well, I know what it's like to experience persecution. I know what it's like to experience racism. My ancestors were. So I think that's what's going on. It's a defense mechanism.
Mhm.
Um, I usually don't. I'm not very persuasive if people say that, but
Yeah.
what immediately springs to mind is the historical aspect.
Yeah.
Um, there was a time in the 1500s, early 1600s, when race-based chattel slavery wasn't a an established institution.
Mhm.
In that time, there was a spectrum of unfree labor.
Mhm.
That spectrum went from forms of almost convict leasing
Mhm.
to indentured servitude to more of what we would categorize as slavery.
Mhm.
Um, in that time, true enough, Europeans experienced unfree labor, and in Europe, they experienced unfree labor as well. But there are
Mhm.
massive differences,
Mhm.
which, to me and you who know the history seem obvious, but there are a lot of people who don't know the history. So the
Mhm.
massive differences are the indentured servitude was not based on skin color.
Right. Right.
There were massive differences in that over time people of European descent, no matter your nation of origin, could become white.
Yeah.
And there was no sense in which a black person could become white unless you were light enough to quote unquote pass. Um,
Mhm.
and then I think the biggest thing is the chattel part of race-based chattel slavery. Chattel means property.
Mhm.
And so the United States perfected a particularly insidious form of slavery that by law converted people into property
Mhm.
that could be bought or sold. Or one of the things that stands out to me historically, enslaved people could be passed down as an inheritance from parents to children.
Mhm.
And so, Black people in certain instances might hope for emancipation once the slave owner died,
Mhm.
only to find that when that person died, they had passed them on to their son or daughter
Right.
or
Right.
something like that. So the experience of being commodified as and categorized as literal property along the same line as a plow or a horse or a
Mhm.
piece of real estate.
Mhm.
That's not something that people of European descent experienced in this country, and so it's
Mhm.
very different uh, to 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 draw on that experience.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's the difference between human rights and civil rights. Like
Mm,
like Black people, we've had to first fight for our humanity and then civil rights.
right.
Other groups might have had to fight for civil rights, but
Right.
it's not an issue of humanity. That poignant picture of the during the sanitation workers strike holding the sign, "I am a man.
Oh,
I'm
that's
a
such a
man. I'm a
powerful
man.
phrase and
I'm
a sad and
human."
tragic one. Yeah.
No. So that came first, just, "I'm a man."
Like, hey, I'm human too. How about we start there and then
Yeah,
talk about
yeah,
civil rights?
yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah,
and to the white folks who are listening, it's not to say that there hasn't been tragedy, hardship, or persecution in your life. It's just been different, and it's
yeah,
not wise, even just from the historical record, let alone from a personal or cultural aspect, to compare what your European ancestors went through with what my African ancestors went through. It's
yeah,
just different, and don't
yeah.
equate them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I've often thought, like, in the mid 19th century, when there were so many Irish and Italian immigrants coming, by the by the next generation, when the accent was gone,
Yeah, exactly.
the Irish and Italians began to dominate the police and fire departments.
Yes. Yes.
You know, and still do today to some degree.
Yeah.
And, Black people have never been allowed to dominate police and fire departments.
No.
Yeah, yeah, and also their children could go to all white schools in the South during
Yeah.
segregation because their children were white, so they benefited from that education, and it's just so many things like you're saying. Yeah. 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 You know what? I the episode that I just recorded a week ago, I was on book bannings,
Mm,
and as we're talking about awareness, um one of the things that I've said again and again, I'm sure you've said again and again, is read, read, read. Like you said,
mm,
there's no excuse in this information age not to know stuff. And how, again, interesting and tragic that that's being attacked today.
yes.
Reading, when we're finally gaining some ground in some books being in part of school curricula, and gaining some ground in the area of books, and that's the very thing that's a hot
Right.
button topic right now. So,
And it's a
yeah.
backlash. It's a reaction to a lot of different things. Most recently, the summer of 2020 and the protests on behalf of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor,
Mhm,
um, and it was during that summer that my book, The Color of Compromise, became a New York Times bestseller. It was
mhm,
this. I think it was a record-breaking season on the bestseller list for the number of books by Black authors on that
mhm,
list.
mhm,
And the book banning is a response and an attempt to fight back against the awareness that was being raised in that
mhm,
summer.
mhm.
So there's reasons that we're seeing this now. I think even one of my books, I think it was the Young Readers edition of How to Fight Racism, was on a proposed book ban list in Hillsdale, Michigan, which is, of
Gosh.
course, the home of Hillsdale College. And they came up with the 1776 curriculum in
Oh,
response to the 1619 project.
mhm,
And the governor of Tennessee, among others, is trying to get a bunch of charter schools that were founded in conjunction with Hillsdale College and the 1776 curriculum, trying to get them to proliferate in Tennessee. And there are other states doing the same thing. So I say all that because it's important for us to recognize that the attempt to suppress this
mhm,
information about
mhm,
race and racism is partly a response
mhm,
to efforts like yours and ours to raise awareness. And
mhm.
far from being a discouragement, I think that should be an encouragement to us to keep going because
Yeah,
something we were doing was bugging them.
right,
And
yeah, right,
you
right,
know?
right. Yeah, yeah, so good. So let's shift to the R in our relationship. If you are Christian and you desire to have diverse friendships, and one of the things that I say to white people a lot, not just white people, but mostly white people, is the importance of diverse friendships, and
Mm,
friendships that go deep enough where you could ask, kind of, please don't think I'm a racist, but
right.
where you could
Right.
ask those kinds of questions and get a straight answer. So it's the importance of friendship, and one of the best places, if you're a Christian, to find those places is in the church, if the church
Mhm.
is racially diverse.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, at one time, I still do believe so much in the God's vision of an integrated church, that that was the subject of my first book, and um, but the belief that multiculturalism is God's idea. But I think I was a little naive about how hard that would be.
Mhm.
Um, And so you've shared on Pass the Mic and in Color of Compromise and this book too that that Black Christians started to, if I'm remembering correctly, started to join a lot of white-led evangelical churches in the 1990s,
Yeah.
but then started to leave and the racial reconciliation movement in the 1990s, but then started to leave after Michael Brown was killed. Can you
Right.
talk about that? What caused Black people to join those churches, and then what caused Black people to leave those churches?
Yeah. Two crucial books, I think, on understanding racial reconciliation efforts, multicultural churches in the U.S. Michael Emerson and Christian Smith's book, Divided by Faith. They're
Mm,
two sociologists that basically try to explain, sociologically speaking, why 11 o'clock a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. So
mm,
that's one. The other book is by Corey L. Edwards, who's a professor of sociology at the Ohio State University, and she wrote a book called The Elusive Dream, where she does a study of a congregation and its attempt to be multiracial, and basically how it failed in
mhm,
that attempt because of the pressure exerted upon it by white members mainly. So that's just further background and resources, Divided by Faith and The Elusive Dream.
yeah,
And
thank you.
what I say is, historically speaking, from the 1990s to, I would argue, probably the early 2010s, was sort of the height of the modern evangelical racial reconciliation movement, by which I mean multiracial churches were celebrated, seen as a positive good. The number of multiracial churches tripled from about 6% to around 18% or 19% in that time period. You're seeing like more Black pastors in leadership and things of that nature. You have in 1995 the Southern Baptist Convention repenting finally 150 years later of its
Yeah,
slavery origins. You have the Memphis Miracle, where Black and white Pentecostals are reunifying. So all of this is happening, but things start to fall apart. There's a whole bunch of stuff that caused it. The election of Barack Obama, you mentioned, referenced that before. That was a big deal. We didn't recognize probably at the time how big of a deal and what was coming, but that sort of sparked the Tea Party movement, right, which morphs into the modern sort of Trumpism and white Christian nationalist movement. You also get the murder of Trayvon Martin. We have, folks out there, including myself, saying we're part of the Trayvon Martin generation, people who really became activated around racial justice, learning about that murder. But then, of course, you have Mike Brown and the rise of Black Lives Matter as a movement. And then we hear all our evangelical friends who supposedly were on this racial reconciliation train saying, well, all lives matter and blue lives matter and Black Lives Matter is just a terrorist organization. They're anarchists. They're just want to loot and steal and all this stuff. And then you get Trump, and it's like 81% of evangelicals who voted for Trump. And you're
yeah,
like, what? So
right.
what happened in my view is a sifting is taking place in the church, where churches and faith communities are declaring and being forced to declare more clearly where they truly stand about issues of racial justice.
Mhm,
And Black people were witnessing this, and we're in these congregations, and we're seeing they're not nearly as committed as we hoped. We're
mhm,
seeing we're not nearly as integrated as we thought we were, because
mhm,
they're drawing lines with Black Lives Matter. They're drawing lines with Trump. They're drawing lines with even wearing masks or gun control or any of these things, right?
mhm,
And um, we began to say, it's not working.
mhm,
I've sacrificed so much. We sacrifice so much to be
mhm.
in these spaces. The cultural cues, the songs and the music, the being
Yeah,
around people who look like us and understand our experiences, dealing with the microaggressions and the gaslighting and the instances of racism that we encountered, the pain of yet another Black person killed and it's caught on video and not a word is mentioned in
yeah,
church or from the pulpit, right? We gave up so much only to turn around and find they weren't truly as with us as they claimed to be or as that we hoped we would be. And more of us have left.
yeah, yeah. It was, I think, a wake-up call, instead of being integrated, there was an assumption of assimilation,
Hmm.
meaning meaning we want you here. I think in some respects, we're theologically convinced that we're supposed to be together.
Yes.
Um, and we'll say that we're sorry for slavery and racism. There was some ownership of that, the foot washing services and stuff like that. And we want you here, and we're going to cherry pick exactly what we want from the Black experience.
Yes.
We want some of your music. We want this, but that's
Also in the
all.
brochure and the pictures on the
Then the
webpage.
pictures
Yeah.
of black and white kids playing together in Sunday school or whatever. Well, and we'll have a Black preacher in every now and again. But when it comes to truly understanding, trying to understand what you're going through when these things happen, um, when it comes to weeping with those who weep, when it comes to acknowledging police brutality, and when it comes to and just any depth of understanding and empathy, it just wasn't
Right.
there.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's really painful, but it's also a bit of a conundrum or a tension because, again, sociologically speaking, white people tend to understand racism purely in individualistic terms. It's
Yeah.
just one person's feeling about another person, and therefore, if I'm nice to black people, I'm not racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body, and that's the whole thing. No
Yes.
analysis of systems, institutions, policies, practices, anything like that. But the irony is, the way you get white people who understand racism only in its individualistic terms to understand it in its institutional terms is through relationships with individuals. So
Right.
the way people change their minds, and in this case, white Christians changing their minds to be more, savvy about race and racism is
Mhm.
through relationships.
Yeah.
So the more contact a white person has with not just the one black friend, it's a
Yes.
network of relationships, right? That's the challenge.
Mhm.
um, is it's not just one person that they can be very influential, but it really takes a constellation of people who are different from you with different perspectives to start to shift your thinking. And what happens there is the more meaningful relationships that white people have with more black people and other people of color, the more they tend to see the institutional and systemic aspects of racism, and then can really be an ally and part of the solution.
Yeah.
um, so we're stuck together. That's why I had to include the R in the arc of racial justice, because people, we get aware and we get mad and we want to take action and we say, this relationship stuff isn't working. We just need to change the law, right? It's true enough, but that tends to happen through relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
God set it up that way on purpose. He's like, y'all are gonna have. It's like a parent saying, locking the kids in the room, say, you're gonna have to figure out a way to get along.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's really true. It's through relationships, which is hard because I have white friends who live in white communities in white towns. Like they can't, like, we're long distance friends. They couldn't find a black person to
Yeah,
be friends
yeah,
with if they tried. There's no way their church is going to be multiracial,
right,
maybe diverse in terms of economic diversity or whatever, but
yeah,
it's going to be a white church. And so I think it's hard because, something that you said, the church is downstream from the rest of the culture, meaning our culture is so segregated. We live in segregated neighborhoods, which means segregated schools, which means, you know, every we live such a segregated existence. It could be hard to not only have one black friend, but a network of black
yeah.
friends.
Seems impossible.
And
Yeah,
but that's all the fruit of our history. America was segregated, on purpose,
right,
and we're
right.
still living with that.
I mean, I tell white people like that's going to be really hard for you to have these relationships because you've literally spent centuries figuring out ways to separate and segregate yourselves from other people.
Yeah,
And so it's going to take at least as much, if not more work
yeah,
to put yourself in the way of the
yeah.
people you've been trying to get away from.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, I was a on staff of a white-led church for almost 20 years, and then again in a different church for almost 5 years. And, like you, I think I read in your book, just sort of wanted to be part of the solution at these churches. And, first of all, just experienced a lot of spiritual growth there, so it wasn't like
Mm,
all me coming
yeah,
in with my altruistic reasons, but I grew a lot spiritually there, but also after I began to read more and understand more about racial injustice, I sort of saw myself as part of the solution in these places. Um, and I think I did help to raise awareness for some things, but like we said before, it was only little bits and pieces, and there was this assumption of assimilation. I
mm,
remember when a friend, said to me, "Nicole, you just talk about race so much," and I
there
said,
it is.
"Well," I said, "First of all, my first book was about race, and then secondly, I have a Black family." I have
Mm,
a Black husband and teenage sons, and I'm watching this unfold. This was a few years ago. I'm watching this unfold in our country, and so A, I've always been passionate about it, and B, even more so now.
right.
um, so anyway, so then, fast forward to 2021, my family joined a Black church and just began to exhale and
Mm, mm,
to have a Black pastor who gets it,
yeah,
and to sit under Black leadership, to be surrounded by Black excellence and saturated in Black culture. It just it was and
I hear
still
you
is.
exhaling right now.
Yes,
Absolutely.
it was
Yeah,
and still is just such an oasis.
yeah.
I don't know if you know anything about Rochester, New York, but Rochester, New York is incredibly segregated,
Mm,
and, we live in a mostly white suburb, um, and go into the city for this church to be this oasis for our family. Um, and you shared that you had a similar experience saved in a white church, went to a white seminary, part of the PCA,
yes.
Presbyterian
PCA. Mhm.
PCA
Yeah,
church. And it's just sort of a similar journey. Can you talk
that's
about
right.
that for a minute?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I came to faith in a white evangelical youth group, started going to the white evangelical church, discovered Reformed theology in college, which was even more white than white evangelicalism. And all along the way, again, like you said, experienced spiritual growth there, had some really great relationships, but race wasn't on the radar. They were
Mhm,
really on this big colorblind tip. But we don't see color, which is just another way of avoiding the issues that
mhm,
come with color or the ways we've ascribed meaning to it, right?
mhm,
And then fast forward, I go to seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. It's Reformed Theological Seminary, which has ties to Southern Presbyterianism, even though people I talked to went to great lengths to say, "Oh, we weren't that," because it was named during the it arose during the Civil War, and its name was the Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America, and that tradition continued on after the Civil War.
mhm,
And even though the seminary is not denominationally affiliated, a lot of its founders were Southern Presbyterians, so that was in the DNA of
mhm,
the institution. Now, we were talking before we press record about I was the founder of something called the African American Leadership Initiative. Well, the reason we needed something like that is because when I got there, you could count on one hand the number of Black American students there were. And
mhm,
mind you, this is in Jackson, Mississippi, where it's over 80% Black. So that tells you sort
Oh,
of the
wow.
reputation, this seminary had in the Black community, and mind you, it wasn't because Black people didn't value education. We love education. We
That's
love going all these pastors love going to seminary, right? But it just wasn't seen they didn't see it as a place for them.
mhm,
So there was all of that, and then the PCA is the denomination that grew out of Southern Presbyterianism. It's strongest in the Southeast, in the former Confederate States. And I was in one of the most conservative areas of one of the most conservative denominations. And I just experienced constant pushback. And
mhm,
I didn't even speak then, 10 years ago, as forthrightly as I do today. But the
mhm,
little I said,
mhm,
so I'll give you an example. It was sometime around, uh, Trump's election. I think he was still a candidate at the time, and I didn't post often about politics, but I think I said something sort of mildly disapproving of Trump, right?
mhm,
And one of the members at my church, this is an intentionally multiracial church with a Black pastor, one of the members who's white essentially called the elders on me. He went because I was an intern at the church, and he went and he reported this Facebook post to the elders and said, "Hey, your intern is putting stuff like this on social media. You need to talk to him."
mhm.
And that was bad enough, but what really got me was they decided to still to talk to me. Like they decided to take his complaint seriously instead of saying, "You know what? He's an independent citizen. He is speaking on his own social media platform. He has freedom of speech. He can have his own political opinions. You can disagree and you can have your own. End of story." It really hurt me that they thought they actually needed to have a sit down with me and talk about it. But I challenged them. This is when I first started, saying, wait a minute.
Mhm,
Something's
mhm.
wrong here. And I don't need to just be silent and take it. I was like, does this talking to the elders, does this in your minds rise to the level of sin? Because that's essentially what this is about. In a Presbyterian system, you call the elders on somebody, you're saying there's a moral, ethical issue there. And I expressed a very mild political opinion, and you're calling me in to essentially get disciplined? Like, no, oh, no, no, no. We just want to have a conversation. Like, but the way this thing is set up,
Right.
happening, right?
Right.
So that was just one of the many. And I started the Witness, a Black Christian collective. So we're writing about it. We've got a podcast on it. So we're just getting arrows
Yeah,
online, in person, all these places. And all of that was part of my journey out of predominantly white Christian spaces and even multiracial spaces because they were still culturally catering to white people.
yeah. So what do you this is my second to last question. So, um, how what's the is there any hope for multicultural churches? Like, having said that, and um
Yeah.
should that still be the goal? Like, if you're a white pastor, um, should should that still be your goal to have a diverse church? Should that still be something we desire, or is that just kind of dead in the water?
I think there's a place for multiracial churches. I think they can be done well. I think they were a lot rarer than we would hope, because you have to resist, both sort of society and culture in general, but also probably your Christian tradition. If you're part of a denomination or a network of churches that's predominantly white, there's always going to be a pull back
Mhm.
toward, white cultural norms and sensitivities as the default. So you're going to have to constantly face those headwinds, which gets really exhausting. And certainly for the pastors and the leadership, but I would argue even more so for congregants of color.
Yeah,
But it can be done, and I think they're especially helpful for, the increasing number of multiracial families that we have, right?
right.
And kids who are, all kinds of, across the spectrum. They don't
Yeah.
fit just one box or one category.
Yeah.
a multiracial church might be effective for those kinds of families. So there is a place for that. But one of the things that I say is I think we really get into dangerous territory when we make multiracial, multi-ethnic the goal instead of the byproduct. Um,
Yeah.
so when being diverse is the goal, what that does is push us in a posture of facing inward,
Mm.
of looking at our congregation in terms of, the proportions of different racial and ethnic groups represented. And it really pushes us, even inadvertently, to think in terms of how can we maintain or increase our diversity, which typically over time means how can we keep the peace?
Mhm.
How can we avoid talking about topics or talking about topics in a way that would potentially divide
Mhm.
and do damage to the diversity that we're trying to build?
Mhm.
So it makes the diversity the goal, in which case, over time, may not start out this way, but over time, it becomes how can we avoid conflict and keep
Yeah.
the diversity?
Wow.
So I think that's a danger there. I think diversity can be a byproduct if the goal is justice.
Wow.
If the goal, I think of any team, you know, any team that's effective doesn't make sportsmanship and cooperation the goal.
Mm.
Winning is the goal. A championship is the goal.
Right.
Beating the next team is the goal. And then you unite around that goal. Now
Yes.
you have a reason to come together. Now you
Yeah.
have a reason to value somebody else's gifts that are different from yours, because we need both of those to win, to achieve
Mhm.
the goal, to be whatever, right? So I think
Mhm.
there has to be something outside of ourselves that forces us not to sort of sit in a circle and all look at each other, but
Mhm.
actually turns us outward and gets us in alignment toward a greater goal and purpose. And then you look left and you look right and you're like, you're here. You're here. How did we get here?
Right.
Oh, we're going toward the same goal, right? So
Right.
so that's where I think it can be effective. Yeah,
I think you see that in the abolitionist movement and the civil rights movement,
exactly.
where white people joined white people who cared about justice
That's right.
joined those movements despite what their family and friends were saying, and were
Perfect.
willing, in some cases, to put their lives on the line. Yeah,
100%. Yeah,
yeah,
that's exactly what happened. And within that, as the black church helping to lead the way, because
right.
the black church is fundamentally a prophetic tradition, because as I say in The Color of Compromise, there would be no black church without racism in the white church. So it's
Mhm,
really the oldest sort of entity in the United States, expressly founded for Black dignity and for the purpose of resisting racism. And
mhm,
so, again, close to the problem, close to the solution. When Black folks united around the cause of abolishing slavery or overturning Jim Crow, that became a rallying point in our culture and our society for other people to come alongside. And then we did find alliances, not just with white people but with people of other faiths, Jewish people and secular
Muslim,
people and Muslim people. And
right.
it was an amazing pantheon of people allied together in support of the same cause.
Yeah, yeah. So good. Wow. Well, just to wrap up, this is the C is gonna get the least amount of our time, but, um, you know, you started your book, this book, How to Fight Racism, with something is different this time, and something seems different this time. And do you still feel like something is different, that the kind of commitment, the passion, the dedication that we saw rising out of 2020, do you feel like that commitment still holds? Both both in individuals that as well as, our American culture as a whole.
Yeah. I think one of the things that led me to say something's different this time is just on a very basic level, the scope of the protests,
Mm.
um, and the scale of the protests. So just by the numbers, you had tens of millions of people
Mhm.
participating in marches and protests of some form, which actually dwarfs the participation even during the civil rights movement.
Mhm.
And in addition, the composition of those protests demographically was more diverse than ever before.
Mhm.
So in the civil rights movement, although as we were just talking about, we had Jewish allies and white allies and other folks participating, Black people were still by far the majority putting
Mhm.
themselves on the line for these things. In 2020, you had some marches and protests that were majority white because they're in like Seattle or Portland or something, right?
Yes, right.
Um, and so that was very unique in American history. Those protests in general, very unique in American history. Folks will argue, and I understand that, well, no, it wasn't different because look where we are now. We still have anti-Black police brutality, which is what, sparked the whole thing. We're still dealing
Yeah.
with all these forms of racism, to which I say, yes, that's true. But a couple of things. Number one, I think people were catalyzed in that movement in a way that some people were catalyzed by the lynching of Emmett Till.
Mhm.
That it awakened something, especially for a lot of white people. When I ask white people, like, what was your moment that the light bulb came on that you needed to get involved and be part of the solution around this issue of racism? And so many people point to 2020.
Mhm.
And as you referenced, there were a lot of people who said, "How did we get here?" To their credit, they started the journey to try to figure that out, and
Yeah.
they're changed because of it. So there's just going to be there already is a whole generation of people who, because of 2020, will never be the same and will
Mhm.
never maneuver quite the same.
Mhm.
The other thing I say is, as we look at 2020, we cannot measure a movement purely by the progress it makes. We also have to look at the opposition it faces.
Mhm.
So there was a tremendous and negative response to the momentum of 2020.
Mhm.
In January 6, 2021, we have an
Mhm.
attempt to overthrow a lawful, legitimate election. We
Mhm.
have all of these woke wars, this anti-CRT crusade, this
Mhm.
so-called indoctrination around race, right? All of that is in part a response to 2020. And again, something that we said before, that should not be seen as a discouragement, but an encouragement that we were onto something and that it scared the racists,
Yes.
and they felt the need to close ranks and try to go on the offensive because we were actually making progress.
Yeah.
Now, did the corporations who pledged millions of dollars follow through? We're seeing that no. Well, the way I look for progress is much more at a grassroots level.
Yeah. Yeah.
So right now I'm working on a podcast series simply called Fighting Racism, and we put out a call for submissions. We said we want to know from everyday folks in your everyday life, how are you trying to fight racism? How are you trying to do your part in ways big and small,
Mhm.
mundane and exceptional? And we got a flood of responses. And,
Wow.
and so many interesting stories, so many inspiring stories. And I think that's going to be where the story is. That's going to be where we see the progress. It'll take time for these national policies to come around. It'll take time for these multinational corporations to come around. But what we can see is that mustard seed.
Yeah.
We can see that leaven, right?
Mhm.
And we can
Mhm.
remember that where the church was most effective in doing justice, it was never the majority,
Yeah, right.
it was never popular,
Right.
but it
Yeah.
was salt. It
Yeah.
was a point of light in the darkness. And that's why I think we have reason to hope and to
Yeah.
keep going.
Yeah. There's always been a remnant and there still is.
That's right.
Yeah, so good. Yeah, so good. And wind in our sails. Thank you so much, Jamar. Thank you so much for your time. Everybody should read this book, How to Fight Racism,
Thank you. Yes.
well as The Color of Compromise, and buy the Young Readers edition for your young people in your life.
And
And
head to my Substack at jamartisby.substack.com. You can hear all my spiciest, latest takes there.
that's great. It's wonderful, wonderful, so wonderful to have you. Thank you so much.
I appreciate this conversation on race. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, you're welcome. See you next time.